We as a group do most importantly want to beseech President Reagan and our fellow Americans to refrain from any form of military or violent means as an attempt, no matter how noble or heroic, to secure our freedom. That would only cause, in our estimation, additional, unneeded, and unwarranted deaths among innocent peoples.
Today, it became quite literally a hostage drama, as those holding the hostages stage-managed a tightly controlled news conference. Good evening, I'm Ted Koppel, and this is Nightline. It is happening now in one form or another all over the world. Americans are being targeted and used by terrorists. Is it just a series of unrelated incidents, or, as President Reagan suggests, a coordinated war against the United States? Our guests, former CIA Director Richard Helms and former British Minister of State for Foreign Affairs, Lord Chalfont.
This is ABC News Nightline. Reporting from Washington, Ted Koppel.
As of today, it would appear that the hostages are alive, and with the possible exception of one man who has a lung condition, all well. Alan Conwell, elected as a spokesman by the rest of the hostages, told newsmen in Beirut today that he had personally spoken today with every other hostage excepting the crew of the TWA jetliner, and they, of course, were seen and interviewed yesterday. But for all that, the release of the hostages seems no closer to being realized. Standing by now, live at the State Department, is ABC's national security correspondent, John McWethy. John, I get the impression from brief conversation you and I had before we went on the air that you are not exactly smelling optimism over there at the State Department.
Well, I am smelling a great deal of effort, I'll put it that way, Ted. The United States has put out its diplomatic nets, and it ranges, the kind of efforts range from using Jesse Jackson or letters from Muhammad Ali to using such interesting governments as Syria, Algeria, Switzerland, places like that, to try and make some sort of contact, try and effect some sort of breakthrough. But I must tell you at this point, because of the number of different groups that the hostages are being held by, I think it is not a very positive sign.
I've got to ask you one thing. When you talk about these contacts, the administration has said, of course, it's not going to negotiate. What is this called, then, if it's not negotiating?
Well, the administration on the very first day said we will not yield to demands of terrorists, but we will talk. And I think that's what they're doing. They're trying to talk.
Now, Nabi Berri, the Amal leader, is regarded, in relative terms at least, as being a moderate. Is he also regarded now by the specialists at the State Department as being in charge?
Well, I think a better way to describe it is he is about the only game in town. People at the State Department are extremely concerned, are questioning whether or not he can really deliver. I think it's pretty clear as of today that he does not have real full control over all the hostages. Some of the hostages are being held by another group called the Hezbollah, and that is a far more radical and probably a far more difficult group to negotiate with.
Sum it up for me in terms of today's news conference, the one that we all saw. Was the State Department relieved by that, encouraged by that, upset by that?
I think there is very little doubt that they were relieved to see that, or apparently that most of the hostages are all right, but I think they were outraged by the spectacle of it. They felt that the statement that was made by the hostages, that Israel ought to go ahead and release the Shiite prisoners, was a statement made under duress.
Any thought as to how this thing is going to be resolved in terms of stage managing that release of the Shiite prisoners in some kind of indirect coordination with the release of the hostages?
I think it is going to take a very long time. It's going to require that Israel do some things on its own without prompting from the United States. Thus far, Israel has shown no inclination to do that. In fact, the United States has encouraged them not to do that indirectly by saying, we do not yield to terrorist demands and do not want our friends to do so either. So at this point, I don't think very much is happening.
John, thank you. At Arlington National Cemetery today, a reminder that the seizure of TWA Flight 847 involved not just the taking of hostages, but also the loss of an American life. Burial services with full military honors were held for Navy diver Robert Steedham, who was killed by the terrorists. In El Salvador last night, another terrorist attack killed 6 Americans and 9 other persons. Are these individual acts of terrorism or part of a broader assault on the free world? We'll look at that question when we return.
Terrorist attacks in the past week have killed at least 82 people and injured 227 others in 10 countries. 17 people were shot to death in assassinations and executions. 56 people died in car bombings, and 9 were killed in other terrorist bombings. This is ABC News Nightline, brought to you by Kraft.
Should I tell folks my award-winning barbecue sauce is really Kraft, thick and spicy?
Jimmy Joe!
The press.
What's the secret behind your famous barbecue sauce?
You mean, how it's so thick it stands up to my drumstick test?
Great shot.
Uh-huh, and spices you can see. Got 'em. And taste. Ooh-wee! My secret?
Yeah?
Talent. Pure talent.
Kraft thick and spicy barbecue sauce.
Now in 2 great new flavors.
At some places that sell computer equipment is all you get. But Entree Computer Centers give you something extra. People who are with you every step of the way. Entree consultants and software experts who make sure you get what's best for your business. Entree instructors, installers, technicians. At Entree, you get more than leading brands of equipment and software. You get people who help you get the most out of it for as long as you own it. At Entree Computer Centers, we're with you every step of the way.
The black hole of American business, where travel and entertainment dollars often vanish without a trace. To help end this financial drain comes a whole new way of booking, tracking, and paying for your company's business travel. Introducing the American Express Travel Management System. It puts you in control, not the black hole.
Old Reliable Allegheny Plywood, 35th and Smallman Streets in Lawrenceville, stocks high-quality building materials. This week, during Old Reliable Days, we're featuring genuine Masonite pre-finished staccato siding. Beautiful, high-quality paneling for interior or exterior use. Also featured this week at Old Reliable is Permadoor, a high-quality all-steel replacement door and frame available in 60 beautiful designs, providing excellent security and energy efficiency. It's nice to do business with reliable people. Allegheny Plywood, 621-6804.
Terrorism continues.
Beirut, El Salvador, and elsewhere. We'll keep you posted on what's happening around the world.
The experience of Peter Jennings tomorrow on ABC's World News Tonight.
In El Salvador last night, a grim reminder that no U.S. administration can afford to concentrate its attention on any single terrorist crisis. An attack in the Salvadoran capital that took the lives of Americans and Salvadorans, but seemed to be focused on the American presence there. As Nightline correspondent Jed Duvall tells us, the message seen in this by the Reagan administration is that terrorists are not operating on a piecemeal basis. They're fighting a coordinated war.
The war which terrorists are waging is not only directed against the United States, it is a war against all of civilized society.
The White House press secretary is uttering the words of the president, a reaction to the killing of 15 persons last night in El Salvador. 6 of those shot at this scene were Americans, 4 Marines and 2 businessmen. This is a war, the president said, a terrorist war against the United States and its allies, mentioning yesterday's bomb blast at the airport in Frankfurt, West Germany. There, a man thought to be Portuguese and 2 young children believed to be Australians were killed. Through Mr. Speaks, the president also said this.
This is a war in which innocent civilians are targets. This is a war in which innocent civilians are intentional victims, and our servicemen have become specific targets.
Robert Dean Steedham was killed by criminals who singled him out for death because he carried with pride among his papers the information that he was a member of the armed forces of the United States of America.
As the president's statement was being read, the funeral of Robert Dean Steedham was being conducted. Steedham was the 23-year-old sailor killed by the hijackers of TWA Flight 847.
Robert gave his life not for one individual and not for 2, but for every single person here today, and for every single person in our nation, and for every single person in the free world today.
Many different terrorist groups have in common their perception of the United States as the chief enemy. Palestinians hijacked 3 planes in one day in September of 1970, exchanged 300 passengers for jailed terrorists, and blew up the planes. The Red Brigade in Italy kidnapped U.S. General James Dozier. He was later rescued. It was Shiite militants who bombed the U.S. Embassy in Beirut and the Marine barracks there 2 years ago.
We of the Western world must act together, as we did over a century ago to wipe out piracy from the seas, and as we did 45 years ago against the threat of tyranny.
I don't comment.
This week, the action has come in rapid succession in Beirut, in West Germany, in El Salvador. For 17 years, various shadowy extremist groups around the world have conducted attacks against the U.S. and Western allies. They have developed rules of engagement in this terrorist war to strike where their enemy, the United States mainly, is most vulnerable. Terrorists in the Middle East have recently learned to hold on to American hostages because America has promised in the past not to strike back violently when lives are at stake.
I'm determined to do the best I can through diplomatic means and through peaceful means to ensure the safety of our hostages and their release.
I have to wait it out as long as those people are there and threatened and alive, and we have a possibility of bringing them home.
Knowing that to be American policy, terrorists in Lebanon may have deliberately insured themselves against American strikes by holding these 7 U.S. citizens. Some were kidnapped in Beirut more than a year ago. If that is one weapon in this war, publicity is another. Today, the most recent hostages were paraded for cameras and microphones to help the kidnappers make their points.
It is also our hope, now that we are pawns in this tense game of nerves, that the governments and peoples involved in this negotiations will allow justice and compassion to guide their way.
Another weapon in the terrorist war is patience. The terrorist waits for the opportunity to strike. America used patience after the embassy in Iran was taken, waiting for more than a year for those hostages to be freed. But, given today's tough talk, the U.S. may now be less patient.
By our very nature, we are slow to anger and magnanimous in helping those in less fortunate circumstances. But we also have our limits, and our limits have been reached.
If the United States has come, after the shocks of the past several days, to regard the situation as a condition of war instead of a series of isolated events, then there is something new after 17 years of attacks. In war, values and responses are different. If, as the President says, this is war, then the initiative need not be left to the enemy. Wars can have several fronts. Stymied in, say, Beirut, the United States can act in other places, at other times. Jed Duvall for Nightline from Washington.
When we come back, 2 views on the question of whether the U.S. is confronted with an all-out terrorist war. We'll talk with former CIA Director Richard Helms and with Lord Chalfont, former British Minister of State for Foreign Affairs.
Introducing the fuel-injected Honda Civic CRX SI. It's a rocket.
Heating or cooling, caring about your comfort is all we do. We and our dealers do it every day for millions of people like you. Count on the man with Train.
Comfort's coming from Train.
Train air conditioning. 50 million people take comfort in it.
On July 4th, Pittsburgh and Channel 4 are going to sparkle. Join us for the celebration all day long at Point State Park. WTAE TV, Pepsi, and City Parks invite you to a day that will explode with entertainment and activities for the whole family. the Pittsburgh Symphony, magnificent fireworks, and performing live in the #1 city at 4 p.m. will be one of today's hottest rock stars, Laura Branigan. The entire day is free. Come on out and celebrate July 4th with Channel 4.
First, it was the end of a job, then the end of an unemployment line, then the end of benefits, and then the end of any real hope for the future. The truth is, some of the finest families in Pittsburgh have reached the end of their rope.
When help is needed most, a helping hand.
WTAE asks you to help. Send what you can to Helping Hand, Box 735, Pittsburgh. Please.
If I were back in Pittsburgh this summer, where would I go for an evening of fun and fantasy, musical magic, and a sneak preview of tomorrow's brightest stars? Heartwood Acres, where Carnegie Mellon's Repertory Theater presents the finest musical comedy, like Sweeney Todd and The Happiest Girl in the World, June 21st through August 10th. Call 578-2407 for tickets. Then mark your calendar. Plan a picnic. Head for the hills. Don't miss it.
With us now live in our Washington bureau is Richard Helms, former director of the CIA and former U.S. ambassador to Iran. And in our London bureau, Lord Chalfont, former British Minister of State for Foreign Affairs and an expert on terrorism who chaired an international conference on terrorism just last year here in Washington. Lord Chalfont, what difference, if any, does it make how one perceives terrorism? That is, as individual, isolated acts, or as a worldwide war, if you will?
I think it makes a very great difference because it will determine the kind of strategy that one uses to defend oneself against it. I think there's now absolutely clear evidence that there's not only an international network of terrorists who exchange training and equipment and intelligence and all kinds of other facilities, but there's also evidence of the sponsorship of those terrorists by sovereign states, by terrorist states. If you look at the incidence of terrorism over recent years, in the last 15 years there have been something like 10,000 major terrorist incidents. Of those, by far the large majority have been directed against the United States and the other countries of the free world. And I am in absolutely no doubt that this is a low-intensity, low-cost form of warfare designed to humiliate and destabilize the United States and its Western allies.
Ambassador Helms, do you agree?
I can't say that I disagree with what Lord Chalfont has said, because the way he has put it, I think he may be accurate. But when we look at the series of incidents of this week, each of these incidents, I think, can be regarded separately. I think each has its own causes and grievances, and that they don't necessarily have to be organized or coordinated by any central authority, and frankly, I don't believe that they are. The difficulties in Beirut with the hostages and so forth has a very clear genesis. Salvador is thousands of miles away, and there's been a civil war going on there for 5 years, of which the United States is supporting one part of the war. The guerrillas are fighting the Salvadorian government as well as the United States.
Let me state the issue in slightly different terms then. Does it not make it easier for the United States to respond? Doesn't it make it more coordinated if we do regard this as a worldwide network of terrorism? Because, for example, at the moment, we seem to be absolutely frozen on the Lebanese front. We can't do anything there because they're holding hostages, but theoretically we could do something elsewhere. So why not look at it that way?
On the contrary, I think that is just the way to make the problem more difficult for ourselves. Lord Chalfont says that we could get together and fight this on a global basis. I don't believe it for a minute. I think that if you don't keep these situations isolated and try and deal with them individually, stalemated though or not, raising them to a higher level and giving them a lot of hype and exaggeration is not going to help to solve the problem. It's going to make it worse.
No, on the other hand, Ambassador, if we underestimate this, we are going to be in very, very serious trouble. I think there are two problems here. One is the immediate problem, and that has obviously got to be solved and dealt with as an individual problem. But we must have a strategy for dealing with this war, which, as Ted Koppel suggested a moment ago, is carried out on many fronts.
I couldn't agree with you more, Lord Chalfont. I think you're absolutely correct. This is something we should have done after the Iranian hostage crisis. Each time when these things go away, we just forget them and then we don't prepare for the next one. We're going to get more of them, and I agree with you 100% that we ought to be doing a lot of planning and coordinating right now to deal with the next one.
All right, let me see if I can narrow. Let me see if I can narrow the focus a little bit then. What I must say disturbs me a little in terms of just plain logic is that we have arrived at a situation now where successive presidents of the United States in effect hand terrorists almost like a strategic defense initiative. They say to them time and again, as long as you hold our hostages, we won't touch you. After you let them go, we may retaliate. Thereby saying to every terrorist group in the world, get yourselves some American hostages. They're the best defense you can get. Now.
Yes, well, I think that if we were to formulate a strategy for the future, we should take the initiative against the terrorist over a whole lot of fronts. I think that we should not always be in a reactive mode. I think, if I may say so, on this particular issue, there is a great deal to be said for the United States turning the tables on the terrorists in the present case and on those who sponsor them, and saying, unless you release these people within a specific time, we shall take certain action, unspecified, but it will be very strong action indeed. And in the future, I think we've got to do a whole lot of things in collaboration in the West which prevent people taking hostages. It can be done. It can be done through preemptive actions. It can be done through economic sanctions. It can be done through stepping up the whole of the coordinated Western attack on terrorism. We tend too much to talk about defense against terrorism. It's time we went over to the counteroffensive. It's time we started coordinating our intelligence, our counteraction, and indeed our preemptive action against these people to prevent this sort of thing happening, so we're not always in a reactive mode.
Let me make an even more shocking proposal, and I'd like to make it to you, Ambassador Helms, and that is this. If one regards this as a case of war, then as in any war, innocent lives are sometimes lost. Even civilians are sometimes killed. Would it not put the President of the United States in a stronger position if he said, the principal responsibility of a government is to its national defense and to the overall national defense. And while we certainly do not want anyone to get hurt, the responsibility for the death of these hostages, if any of them die, is clearly the responsibility of the hostage takers. And we're not going to be restrained by their safety.
Well, I think that what you say is accurate, that if he raises this to actually literal warfare, then he's permitted to do a lot of things which he otherwise wouldn't be permitted to do. The question is, can he take the American people and the American Congress with him? And on this issue, I doubt it.
Lord Chalfont?
I don't think he would take me with him either on that. These people's lives, I think, are important. There are two things that are important. One is the lives of the hostages, and the other is that no one should be seen surrendering to terrorist demands. Now, these two may seem incompatible, but they are not. We now know who holds some of the key to this. Mr. Mnabi Berry says that he can deliver these hostages back to the hostage takers, to the terrorists. In that case, he can also deliver them to the United States. So that's one man who could be in the president's sights.
Although, Lord Chalfont, as you probably heard our national security correspondent say at the top of this program, the State Department doesn't really believe that he has that kind of control over them.
Well, if he hasn't that kind of control, then I think we should turn to those who probably have. I mentioned earlier state-sponsored terrorism. Perhaps I should not be too specific, but I think everybody in Washington will know that there is at least one terrorist state in that area that could probably deliver if they were made to understand that not delivering would bring some very unfortunate results for them.
Well, let's not be too coy about it. You're talking about Syria.
Of course I'm talking about Syria, yes.
And what do you think should be done then?
I think that it should be made quite clear to the Syrians, by whatever channels are most appropriate, that the United States is capable of taking some very, very strong action against them, short, obviously, of military action. We're not threatening to bomb the Syrians, so I hope the President would not do that necessarily, but what he could do is to point out to them that outside military action, there are certain economic, diplomatic, political, and other sanctions that could be taken against them that would make life very, very difficult for them if they do not make sure that their clients in the Lebanon return these hostages to the United States at once or within a specific time to be laid down by the United States administration.
Ambassador Helms, you spent a great deal of time in Iran as U.S. ambassador there. Is this the kind of logic that works in a place like Iran, or for that matter, in a place like Syria? That sounds very logical to a Western ear. Would it have any impact at all in that part of the world?
It might very well, but I would assume this is the kind of thing that would have to be done through diplomatic channels, secretly and very quietly, because after all, as Lord Chalfont knows as well as anybody else, face means a great deal in the Middle East and in Asia. And if we embarrass these people by threatening them publicly, I think that the sanctions of this kind would have very little effect.
All right, let me give voice then to what I suspect a lot of people who are watching tonight may say is, what about our face? What about the embarrassment? What about the humiliation of what these people are doing to the United States?
Well, yes, I think that's a very important point. It must be made clear that the United States and the West as a whole is not going to allow the civilized world to be reduced to a shambles by these murderers and fanatics. I agree with Ambassador Helms that probably the best way of doing this is by quiet diplomatic means, and I would not be surprised if the United States administration were not already trying these channels. But sooner or later, by one means or another, it has to be made abundantly clear to these people, these suicidal fanatics, that we will not surrender to them, and that if any more of those Americans comes to any harm, that the retribution will be swift and it will be savage.
I apologize, Ambassador Helms. I'd hoped you'd get a chance for a comment, but we're flat out of time. And I thank both you and Lord Chalfont very much for coming in. I'll be back in a moment.
This is a box of Jell-O brand gelatin, and you know what this is, and you certainly know who they are. And this is what Jell-O gelatin looks like when you make it, and here's what this looks like. But when you make them together, they can look like this, or even these, which would make them look like this. So if you look at something like this, you'll find this and those and everything else we've been up to, which could inspire you to make this or even this. Although anything you make with Jell-O gelatin and bananas will make them go, even something as simple as this. Jell-O gelatin, we're up to something good.
You are about to see a remarkable demonstration. Here comes Fujifilm with color pictures so true to life, it's a real breakthrough. Fuji HR Films. Fuji's advanced technology has developed ultra-thin color layers unlike any other film in the world. The thinner the layers, the sharper the picture, and the truer the color. Get extraordinary Fuji high-resolution films and get the true picture. Fuji 35mm disc and 110.
Morning is your time. The earth wakes up with you. Always feel that spark of life in everything that you do.
Grape nuts. For you, it's as natural as the morning. No sugar added, no preservatives. Just an honest, nutty crunch. Post Grape Nuts cereal. You know when you have it good.
Yes, you know when you have it good.
Hello, I'm Frank Bartles, and that's Ed James. We have been told there may be other coolers in the marketplace, and this could cause confusion. So if you are not entirely sure yours is a genuine Bartles and James cooler, you should study the label carefully. If it has Bartles and James on top and premium wine cooler down here, then most likely it's an authentic Bartles and James cooler, and you are drinking the very best. We hope this helps, and thank you again for your support.
Stay with ABC News for news-breaking coverage as the hostage crisis continues. Tomorrow on ABC's World News This Morning with Steve Bell and Kathleen Sullivan.
I'm David Hartman. As the hijacked hostage crisis continues in Lebanon, Good Morning America continues to bring you the latest news and the newsmakers. Join us tomorrow on Good Morning America.
ABC News will continue to report on major developments in the crisis involving American hostages in Beirut as events dictate. With full coverage of the story tomorrow on World News This Morning, Good Morning America, and World News Tonight with Peter Jennings. That's our report for tonight. I'm Ted Koppel in Washington. For all of us here at ABC News, good night.
For a transcript of tonight's broadcast, send $2 to Journal Graphics, Box 234, Ansonia Station, New York, New York, 10023.
From the man who